All right, so notes 4.6 are going to cover JFK and the Cold War. We finished Eisenhower, we've actually looked at Truman, we've looked at the Korean War, so now we're going to look at JFK and a little bit at Johnson and his role in the Cold War as well. So the leadership, like I just said, Kennedy and Johnson are the two we're looking at. And in 1960, Kennedy, who was a Democrat, won the election. Eisenhower had just served two terms, 8 years, from 52 to 60. Kennedy ran against Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president. And in the 1960 election, a lot of it had to do with television and how you looked, who looked presidential, who looked calm, collected, and who looked good. And Kennedy was considered to be very good looking, and especially when compared to Nixon. And Kennedy came across as presidential. So he was younger, very tan, like I said, very personable, and that really helped him win the election. It was the first televised debates that year, and so it made a big difference. So Kennedy and Johnson take control, and they have a lot of international issues, a lot of different issues that happen. Kennedy does change the foreign policy of the presidents in the U.S. a little bit with his flexible response. So where Eisenhower had this idea that massive retaliation and brinkmanship were the way to go, Kennedy actually felt like the U.S. needed to be more flexible in their response, hence the term flexible response. They didn't always need to be threatening nuclear war. Different situations called for different responses. Sometimes nuclear war might be the response, and sometimes something else might be the response. So this policy actually meant a buildup of troops needed to happen. We needed to build up more conventional weapons and amass nuclear weapons. So we continue adding to that. This actually expands the arms race because we're actually having a bigger military and things like that, and that's going to increase our military spending. So Kennedy does that. So where Eisenhower actually reduced our military spending by something like $25 million or something like that, Kennedy increases it and actually more than doubles under Kennedy with his flexible response plan. But the idea is we have other options, not just nuclear war. We have choice. So another area where Kennedy increases spending and increases U.S. involvement, not just the arms race, but also the space race. So we remember Sputnik happened in 1957, the first satellite. Then the Soviets in 1961, right after Kennedy takes office, have the first man in space, a cosmonaut. So we have astronauts, they had cosmonauts. So it really kind of feels like to the U.S. that the Soviets are winning the war in space. They're winning the space race. So the concern is if the Soviets win the space race, people might think communism is better than capitalism because they're advancing faster and they're winning this war and they're doing things better than the U.S. And so we're really concerned that if they're doing things better than the U.S., it's going to come across that they win and they are better. So Kennedy realizes he has to do something drastic. So he calls for the U.S. to put a man on the moon. That actually starts the Apollo program. The Apollo program is NASA's program working to put a man on the moon. So here we have our space race to the moon. Ooh, that didn't circle very well. We got the U.S., you got the Soviets, and the U.S. is going to win. So the Apollo program, its sole purpose is to figure out how to put a man on the moon. The U.S. does that by 1969. This picture, Neil Armstrong on the moon, very famous picture. So the U.S. wins the space race for putting a man on the moon. In less than 8 years' time, we do that. So we really feel like we have succeeded and we get ahead of the Soviets under Kennedy's program. Now, Kennedy is not president anymore in 69. He dies in 63. But we see his vision with the Apollo program and the space race continuing on. Now, the arms race, that's not so peaceful. The space race, Kennedy actually does have some peaceful actions to contain communism and some new ideas to contain communism. He wants to promote capitalism, contain communism through both the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps. The Alliance for Progress is specifically in Latin America, so South and Central America. It is money that is being spent and sent to governments in Latin America for them to help improve the education, housing, and health care of the people there. So they're really trying to improve the countries by putting money in. It's kind of like the Marshall Plan was in Europe under Truman right after World War II. So it's kind of like the Marshall Plan, but for Latin America. Now, it says it has mixed results here. And the reason for the mixed results is the leadership in the Latin American countries. Latin American countries that had leadership where they took the money and they actually put it into education, housing, healthcare, and they helped the people, very successful. Those countries did really well. The people's lives got better. They really promoted capitalism and supported that. Countries with corrupt governments that kept the money for themselves, nothing got better and people got very disillusioned, and many of those countries were anti-capitalist and wanted communist governments because the governments they had were really bad. So mixed results for the Alliance for Progress. The Peace Corps still exists today, and it's all about volunteers helping in needy areas. So students, a lot of times after they finished college, they would have some training and then they would go off for 2 years to help in a needy area, sometimes teaching English, teaching medical care, building roads, building schools, building sewage systems, whatever it was that they needed to promote goodwill in other countries. And it still exists today, and we still use it in the same way, where a capitalist country is going out and helping other countries to become better. And with that, it appears that the capitalist countries are successful, they're helping the others be successful, and people really support those countries. So they like the countries. Even if they don't become capitalist, they still feel good about the countries that are helping them. And here we have Kennedy with some Peace Corps volunteers, and this is actually some Peace Corps volunteers today, because the program is still around and is still successful. Now Kennedy, not all his foreign involvements were peaceful, and some of them were more successful than others. The first is going to be his least successful, and we're going to kind of build up to his most successful. The first is called the Bay of Pigs, or the Bay of Pigs invasion. This all centers around Cuba. So Cuba became communist in 1959. There was a revolution in Cuba. I won't go into all the details. We'll talk a little bit more about it in class. But Fidel Castro overthrew the government, which the U.S. had been friendly with, and made the country communist, cuts diplomatic ties with the U.S., and becomes allies with the Soviet Union. Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. This makes us very nervous. Number one, it's a failure of containment, but number two, it also means there is now a communist country in the Western Hemisphere, very close to the U.S. So the U.S. decides they need to do something. Kennedy and the CIA train Cuban nationals to overthrow Castro. So the idea is these Cuban nationals had fled because they didn't support communism. These were people who were very successful and well off under the previous government. Lawyers, doctors, college professors, even some politicians. They're not military personnel. But the CIA trains them. They're going to go in and overthrow Castro, and we'll have support from within, and they'll go in and it'll be wonderful. Revolution. Happy Cuba again. Well, in April of 1961, the U.S. sends in these Cuban nationals to attack Cuba, and it is a total disaster. So, number one, they weren't well trained. Number two, they hadn't had much time. The U.S. was supposed to support them with like air support and things like that, but because at the last minute Kennedy decided he didn't want them to know about the U.S. involvement, we were trying to keep that kind of on a hush-hush basis. He canceled the air support. The boat ran aground. All kinds of problems happened with it, and just a total disaster. So not only the U.S., but the entire world questions not only the U.S.'s international intentions and what are we doing here, but also, is Kennedy a good president? So right off, he took office in 1961. This is only a few months after he took office, and the very first real foreign policy test he had turns into just a disaster. So here are some pictures from that. So the Bay of Pigs down here. You can see how close Cuba is. And here we have captured Cubans after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. So the next foreign policy issue that Kennedy tries to deal with is Berlin, which eventually results in the Berlin Wall in 1961. So also 1961, right after he takes office again, a little later, June. But Kennedy and Khrushchev did not get along. Kennedy met with Khrushchev in 1961, and the idea was the two of them were talking about Berlin and what to do with Berlin. Germany had some problems. Khrushchev was upset. There were a lot of East Germans who were going to West Berlin to defect and not coming back. He wanted us to give Berlin to the Soviets because it was in the middle of Soviet territory. Kennedy refused. He felt very bullied by Khrushchev. And so Kennedy, because he feels bullied and like Khrushchev might attack them, he asks Congress for $2 billion to increase the size of the military. So this goes in with the arms race. A lot of this is going to go to Germany and Berlin. Well, this makes Khrushchev feel threatened. So he responds to this military buildup by literally building a wall to divide East and Western Berlin. So East Berlin is cut from West Berlin. He builds a wall overnight, essentially. Barbed wire and troops go up. So here you see the barbed wire and troops. Here you see the wall itself being built. They build this wall that becomes a literal wall between East and West, between capitalism and communism. It is the symbol of the Cold War for the rest of the war, up until 1990. So for 30 years, it is the symbol of the Cold War, dividing communist and capitalist countries. So somewhat successful in that Kennedy did not give up Berlin. However, then we have this symbol of the Cold War built. So it was kind of a mixed bag of success or not success. But the Cuban Missile Crisis is seen as a huge success for Kennedy and really the biggest of his foreign policy issues that he had to deal with. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, it deals with both Cuba, here's Fidel Castro, the Soviet Union, and the US. And those 14 days in October, huge, huge issue. This is the closest the US ever came to an actual nuclear war. Because in 1962, the US realizes that Cuba is building nuclear missile launch sites. We realize that means they can launch nuclear weapons because of how close they are to us. And if I pop up here to our map, here's our map. They can actually launch weapons essentially anywhere in the US. They're close enough in Cuba to get Denver, to get Washington, D.C., to get New York City. So it's very much a threat to the US. So Kennedy orders a naval blockade to keep the ships away from Cuba. That way they can't deliver the missiles. So the Soviets are bringing the missiles in. Cubans are building up these launch pads. So Kennedy just keeps the missiles out. Khrushchev is threatening the US with war. Kennedy is threatening Khrushchev with war. So they're threatening, but they're also negotiating. So publicly they're threatening one another. Secretly they're negotiating. And Kennedy gets Khrushchev to agree to remove missiles from Cuba. So publicly he says he wins, the nuclear threat is ended. In return, Kennedy actually did take some of our missiles out of Turkey. So there was a compromise, but he got those missiles out and the US felt safe again. So he proved himself a capable leader and showed he was unwilling to go to war. So Kennedy kind of shows those two sides to himself in this. But here, this kind of shows you Kennedy and Khrushchev arm wrestling, fighting. Who's going to win? Who's going to get their way? And so the Cuban Missile Crisis is a huge win for Kennedy. Now that happens in 1962. In November of 1963, Kennedy is assassinated. He's shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. So that is the end of his presidency. Essentially, he's only in office 2 years. He takes office in 61. He's elected in 60, but takes office in 61 and is killed in 63. Oswald is then assassinated by Jack Ruby. So Kennedy's killed, then Oswald, his assassin, is killed, and that's where all the conspiracy questions and all of that come out into play. And we'll talk a little bit about that in class, because I know you'll have questions about it. But Kennedy is killed, and because all these questions come up, they actually have the Warren Commission, which is led by Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court. And they are supposed to investigate all the findings about Kennedy's death and whether or not this was a conspiracy. The Warren Commission says that Oswald acted alone in killing Kennedy. It was a single assassin. There was not a conspiracy. There's still controversy today, but you should know that the Warren Commission determined it was Lee Harvey Oswald alone. So after that, and this is a picture from that day, it is not a picture of the assassination, but a picture before the assassination in Dallas, Texas. This is Lee Harvey Oswald. This is Jack Ruby. So Oswald killed Kennedy, Ruby killed Oswald. And the Warren report said Oswald acted alone. Johnson then becomes president. So Johnson was vice president. He continues many of Kennedy's policies. So Johnson is sworn in as president right away, actually on Air Force One before getting back to D.C. And he continues Kennedy's policies. He has some other contributions later on in regard to the Vietnam War, but we will talk about those when we get to the unit on Vietnam, so you don't have to worry about those at this time. So now you want to make sure you get out your study guide and you go over that with the notes and know exactly what you need to know for your quiz. Make sure if you have questions, you bring those to class.